You don't belong in this cabin. The words sliced through the quiet hum of the jet at 30,000 feet, sharp enough to turn heads without raising a single voice. And for a moment, everything stilled. The soft clink of crystal glasses, the low murmur of conversations, even the steady white noise of the engines seemed to pull back as if the aircraft itself was listening. Naomi Carter didn't flinch, not when the statement landed. Not when a few passengers glanced up with curiosity masked as indifference, and not even when the man, standing beside her seat, straightened his posture like authority had just been handed to him instead of assumed. She sat there in a simple black t-shirt, dark denim, and sneakers that had seen better days, no designer labels, no jewelry catching the cabin lights, nothing that signaled who she really was. And that was exactly how she wanted it. 10 minutes earlier she had walked up the narrow stairs of the private jet alone. No assistant, no entourage, no announcement, just another name on a manifest that no one bothered to read twice. And now here she was, seated quietly in a cream leather chair worth more than most people's monthly rent, being told she didn't belong. Across the aisle, a well-dressed couple in tailored suits accepted flutes of sparkling water with easy smiles, their presence unquestioned, their comfort assumed, while Naomi remained invisible until she wasn't. The lead attendant, Daniel Brooks, stood with a tight expression, clipboard tucked under his arm, his tone controlled but unmistakably dismissive as he gestured toward the rear of the cabin like the solution was obvious, like she had simply wandered into the wrong place by accident. Naomi's eyes lifted slowly, steady and unreadable, taking him in the way someone studies a detail they already understand. And for a brief second something unspoken passed between them, something he didn't recognize but would soon regret ignoring. A younger flight attendant near the galley hesitated, her gaze flicking between Naomi and the manifest screen mounted discreetly behind the service panel, her lips parting like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the permission to do it. The cabin wasn't loud, but it wasn't neutral either. It carried that subtle shift, that charged stillness when people sense a line has been crossed but aren't sure if they should step in or stay comfortable in silence. Naomi rested her hand lightly on the armrest, calm, grounded, as if she had been here before, not just on this jet, but in this exact moment of being measured and dismissed in the same breath. Years ago, she had stood in an airport lounge and heard a similar tone wrapped in different words, watched doors close that she would later own, and learned something most people never do. That power doesn't need to announce itself. It waits, it observes, and when it moves, it doesn't ask for permission. Daniel shifted his weight, impatience creeping into his stance as he glanced toward the cockpit, then back at Naomi, expecting compliance, expecting movement, expecting her to accept the version of reality he had already decided was true. But Naomi didn't move, not an inch, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, even, almost quiet enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. "You're making a mistake," she said, not as a threat, not as a plea, but as a fact delivered with the kind of certainty that doesn't need to be repeated. And somewhere behind them, a screen flickered, unnoticed, as systems began to shift in ways no one in that cabin was prepared to understand. Daniel let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, the kind that carried more disbelief than humor. And for a moment he simply stared at Naomi as if waiting for her to correct herself, as if someone dressed like her could not possibly understand the weight of the words she had just spoken. Then he shook his head slightly and tapped the edge of his clipboard against his palm. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to cooperate," he said, his voice firmer now, drawing a few more eyes from the surrounding seats, not loud enough to cause a scene but deliberate enough to assert control. And that shift was all it took for the atmosphere in the cabin to tighten. Naomi did not look away, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in a way that did not match the situation Daniel believed he was managing, and that mismatch began to irritate him more than her refusal itself. Across the aisle, the couple who had been quietly observing exchanged a glance, the man leaning slightly toward the woman as if to whisper something, but stopping halfway when Naomi's stillness made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. Further back, the younger attendant stepped closer to the service panel, her fingers hovering near the manifest display again, her brow furrowed as she scanned the list more carefully this time, not just names but the details attached to them, the ones most people overlooked. Naomi shifted her gaze briefly toward the window, the endless stretch of clouds outside reflecting faintly against the glass. And for a second her expression softened, not with doubt, but with recognition, as if this moment had already played out in a different place, a different time, years ago when she had learned that silence could be mistaken for weakness by people who had never had to earn their authority. She remembered standing in a boarding area in Atlanta, being asked twice for identification while others walked through with a single glance, remembered the tone, the assumptions, the quiet dismissal wrapped in polite language, and how she had stood there then too, calm, composed, watching, learning. Back in the present, Daniel took a step closer, closing the distance just enough to make his presence feel intentional. This section is reserved, he continued, gesturing subtly toward the front of the cabin, and I cannot have passengers seated here without proper clearance. The word clearance lingered, heavy with implication, and a few passengers nodded faintly, as if the explanation made sense, as if the situation had already been decided. Naomi turned her head back toward him slowly, her eyes steady, not challenging, not defensive, just certain, and that certainty began to unsettle something beneath his practiced professionalism. Behind him, the younger attendant finally spoke, her voice hesitant but clear enough to cut through the tension. Daniel, I think we should double-check the manifest, she said, holding the tablet slightly higher now, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes. But Daniel did not turn, did not even acknowledge her. His focus locked on Naomi as if the entire situation depended on her compliance rather than his accuracy. The engines hummed steadily beneath it all, a constant reminder that they were miles above the ground, enclosed in a space where every decision carried weight, where authority was supposed to be precise, not assumed. Naomi exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and then she spoke again, her tone unchanged. You already have everything you need, she said, and somewhere behind the cabin wall, unnoticed by most, a quiet system alert blinked once, then again, as layers of access began to shift, permissions updating, signals moving through networks that extended far beyond the narrow aisle Daniel believed he controlled. And in that moment, the balance in the room started to tilt, just enough that those paying attention could feel it, even if they could not yet explain why. The shift was subtle at first, almost invisible to anyone not looking for it, but it was there, threading through the cabin like a quiet current beneath still water, and Naomi felt it before anyone else did, not because she was watching the system, but because she understood what happened when control started to slip from the wrong hands. Daniel, however, mistook the silence for hesitation, and that misunderstanding pushed him forward as he straightened his shoulders and took another step closer, his tone tightening just enough to signal that patience was running out. I am not going to repeat myself again, he said, each word measured, deliberate, as if authority could be reinforced by repetition alone, and this time a few passengers leaned back slightly, distancing themselves from the tension while still watching it unfold. Naomi remained seated, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, but there was something different now, something quieter and sharper beneath the surface, like a decision that had already been made and did not need to be spoken aloud. Behind Daniel, the younger attendant shifted her weight and glanced down at the tablet again, her fingers moving faster now as she navigated through layers of the manifest that most crew members never touched, her eyes widening slightly as new information populated the screen, not replacing what had been there before, but expanding it, revealing fields that had been hidden until this exact moment. Daniel, she said again, more urgently this time, there is an override on this account. But he still did not turn, still did not listen, because his focus was locked on the person he believed he needed to control, not the system that was quietly rewriting the situation around him. Across the aisle, the man in the tailored suit lowered his glass slowly, his attention no longer casual, while the woman beside him leaned forward just enough to get a clearer view, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to something closer to concern. Naomi lifted her hand slightly, not to gesture, not to defend, but to rest it more comfortably against the armrest, a small movement that carried an unexpected weight, as if it marked a boundary no one else in the cabin could see. She had learned long ago that moments like this were never about volume, never about who could speak the loudest or move the fastest. They were about timing, about knowing exactly when to let a situation unfold until it revealed itself completely. Daniel exhaled sharply, his patience thinning into frustration, and he glanced briefly toward the cockpit door before looking back at Naomi. "If you do not relocate to your assigned section, I will have to escalate this," he said, the word escalate hanging in the air like a final warning. But even as he spoke it, a soft chime echoed faintly from the service panel behind him, a sound so routine it should have been ignored, except this time it was followed by a second tone, then a third, each one slightly different, slightly out of sequence, enough to make the younger attendant freeze. She stared at the screen, her voice barely above a whisper now. "This is not a standard update," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. As lines of authorization began to populate rapidly, each one stamped with a level of clearance that did not belong to any crew member on board. Naomi's eyes flicked briefly toward the reflection in the window again, the faint outline of the cabin behind her visible against the clouds, and in that reflection, she could see it all, the confusion beginning to surface, the certainty beginning to crack, the moment just before everything shifted. She turned her gaze back to Daniel, calm as ever, and said quietly, "You should stop now." Not as a request, not as a warning filled with emotion, but as a statement of fact, the kind that arrives too late for those who refuse to recognize it. And somewhere beyond the cabin walls, beyond the reach of anyone standing in that narrow aisle, a call was already being placed, a connection already made, and the system that held this entire flight together was beginning to answer to someone Daniel had not even considered. The hesitation finally broke through the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the smallest shift of attention as the younger attendant stepped forward. No longer hiding behind the service panel, her voice steadier now despite the tension pressing in from every direction. "Daniel, I am serious. You need to look at this," she said, holding the tablet out toward him, and this time there was something in her tone that forced a reaction, not authority, not defiance, but certainty. Daniel turned just enough to glance over his shoulder, irritation flashing across his face as if the interruption itself was the problem, not the information being offered. But when his eyes landed on the screen, something in his expression paused, not fully changed, just interrupted, like a thought that had been moving too fast suddenly hitting resistance. The cabin remained quiet, but it was no longer passive. The passengers were watching now with intention, their earlier detachment replaced by a growing awareness that whatever this was, it was no longer routine. Naomi did not move, but she noticed everything, the angle of Daniel's shoulders tightening, the way his grip on the clipboard shifted slightly, the flicker of uncertainty that crossed his face before he pushed it down again. "It is probably a system glitch," he said quickly, more to reassert control than to explain anything, and he turned back toward Naomi as if that settled it, as if reality could be corrected by ignoring what did not fit his expectations. The younger attendant did not step back this time. She stayed where she was, her voice firmer. "It is not a glitch, it is a full access override," she said, and now the words carried weight, not just for Daniel but for anyone within earshot who understood what that meant. Across the aisle, the man in the suit leaned forward slightly, his interest no longer casual, while the woman beside him lowered her glass completely, her attention locked on the exchange. Naomi let a faint breath pass through her, not a sigh, not relief, just acknowledgement, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived exactly on time. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for the first time he looked past Naomi, not at her, but at the space around her, as if trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the information now challenging everything he had assumed. Another soft chime echoed from the panel, sharper this time, followed by a subtle shift in the cabin lighting, barely noticeable but enough to signal that something deeper within the aircraft systems had responded. The younger attendant glanced down again, her eyes widening as new lines appeared, each one more definitive than the last, and she spoke again, quieter now but unmistakably clear. "Primary ownership authorization confirmed," she read, the words hanging in the air like a weight no one could immediately process. Daniel froze, not completely, but just enough that his next movement felt delayed, like he was catching up to something already in motion. Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, her gaze calm, unwavering. And for the first time there was a visible shift in the balance between them. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. "You should have checked," she said softly, not with accusation, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that does not leave room for argument. And in that moment, the authority Daniel had been holding on to began to unravel, not because she took it, but because it had never truly been his to begin with. And now, with the system itself aligning behind her, the entire cabin could feel it, the quiet, irreversible turn of control settling into the hands of the one person who had never needed to raise her voice to prove she belonged. The word ownership did not echo loudly, but it settled into the cabin with a weight that no one could ignore. And for a moment, everything slowed, not physically, but perceptually, like time stretching just enough for every person present to realize that something irreversible had just been revealed. Daniel's posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough that the certainty he had been holding on to began to fracture. His shoulders no longer squared with the same confidence, his grip on the clipboard loosening as his eyes flicked once more to the tablet in the younger attendant's hands, searching for a detail that might contradict what he had just heard, but finding none. Naomi remained exactly where she was, composed, grounded, her presence no longer invisible but undeniable, and yet she did not lean into it, did not claim the moment with volume or spectacle. She simply allowed it to exist, to unfold, to be seen. A quiet memory surfaced in her mind, uninvited but familiar. A hotel lobby years ago where she had stood waiting while others were checked in ahead of her, her reservation questioned, her identity scrutinized, the same pattern, different setting, and she remembered the feeling not of anger, but of clarity, the understanding that this was never about a single moment. It was about a system of assumptions that repeated itself until someone chose to stop it. Back in the cabin, the younger attendant lowered the tablet slightly, her hand still steady but her eyes now fixed on Naomi with a new awareness, as if she was seeing her for the first time, not as a passenger out of place, but as the center of something much larger. Across the aisle, the man in the tailored suit leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful neutrality, while the woman beside him pressed her lips together, her gaze shifting between Daniel and Naomi, as if recalibrating her understanding of the entire situation. Another soft tone sounded from the panel, followed by a subtle shift in the display. And this time, even Daniel could not ignore it as he turned fully toward the screen, his brows drawing together, his voice quieter now, less certain. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked, not to Naomi, but to the attendant. And that change alone spoke louder than anything else, because for the first time, he was asking instead of telling. The attendant swallowed slightly, then read from the screen, her voice clear. "It means full executive control, including crew authority and operational oversight." And the words landed with precision, removing any remaining ambiguity, any space for interpretation. Naomi lifted her gaze to Daniel, her expression calm but firm, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet finality that cut through whatever resistance remained. "It means you were wrong," she said, not harshly, not with satisfaction, but with the kind of truth that does not need emphasis to be understood. The cabin held its breath in that moment, not because of what had been said, but because of what it meant, the shift from assumption to reality, from misplaced authority to actual power, and Daniel felt it fully now, the ground beneath his position giving way, the realization settling in that this was no longer a situation he could manage or control. Naomi did not move, did not rise, did not change her tone, because she did not need to. The system had already spoken for her, the environment had already aligned, and the moment had reached its breaking point, not through force, but through truth, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to reverse. Daniel did not speak immediately, and that silence said more than anything he could have forced into words, because for the first time since this interaction began, he was no longer leading the moment, he was reacting to it, trying to understand where his control had gone and how quickly it had slipped away. The clipboard in his hand lowered slightly, no longer a symbol of authority but just an object, and his eyes moved again to the tablet, then back to Naomi, as if searching for a version of her that matched what he had assumed just minutes ago. But that version was gone, replaced by something far more grounded, far more immovable. Naomi watched him without expression, not cold, not detached, simply present, as if she had already moved beyond the moment he was still trying to process. The younger attendant stepped half a pace back, giving space not out of fear but out of recognition, her role shifting from observer to witness. And in that shift, the entire cabin seemed to realign. Around a new center, a soft voice came from the cockpit intercom, not an announcement, but a direct internal call that triggered a subtle light near the front panel, and the attendant glanced up instinctively before answering, her tone respectful. "Yes, Captain," she said, listening for a second, then nodding slightly. "Understood." And when she looked back at Daniel, there was no hesitation left in her expression. "The captain has been notified," she said quietly, but clearly enough for those nearby to hear. And the implication settled quickly, because in this space, that level of attention did not come without reason. Naomi shifted her gaze briefly toward the front of the cabin, then back to Daniel, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm weight it had from the beginning. "You should stop trying to manage this," she said, not as a challenge, but as guidance. "The kind that comes too late for someone who has already gone too far." Daniel inhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders now visible, and for the first time, there was something else beneath it, not just uncertainty, but realization, the understanding that this situation was no longer about a passenger out of place, but about his own actions being measured against a standard he had not recognized. Across the aisle, the man in the suit cleared his throat softly, shifting in his seat, while the woman beside him looked down briefly, as if reconsidering her earlier silence. Another system tone echoed, followed by a small update on the panel, and this time the text was unmistakable. Crew permissions recalibrating in real time, access levels adjusting. Authority being reassigned not by voice, but by system command. The younger attendant read it quickly, her voice low but steady. Crew hierarchy updated. And then, after a brief pause, primary authority reassigned. And she did not need to say to whom, because everyone in that space already knew. Naomi remained seated, her posture unchanged, her presence now fully aligned with the environment around her, and in that alignment, there was no need for escalation, no need for raised voices or dramatic gestures. Because the shift had already happened, Daniel looked at her again, really. Looked this time, not through assumption, not through expectation, but through the reality that had unfolded in front of him, and the weight of that realization settled fully into place. Naomi met his gaze, calm and unwavering, and said quietly, "This is your last moment to handle this with dignity, not as a threat, not as a command, but as a final opportunity, one that would not come again." And as the cabin held that silence once more, the outcome was no longer uncertain, it was already in motion, steady, precise, and entirely out of his control. The cabin did not erupt, it did not shift all at once, but something deeper settled into place, something final, and it moved through every row like a quiet understanding that could no longer be ignored. Daniel stood there, caught between what he had believed and what was now undeniably in front of him, his posture no longer anchored in authority but in hesitation, and for a brief second, he looked smaller, not physically, but in presence, as if the space itself had outgrown him. Naomi remained seated, composed, her gaze steady, and when she spoke again, her voice did not rise, it did not demand attention, yet it held it completely. "You said I did not belong here," she said, each word deliberate, measured. "But this entire aircraft operates under my name." And the sentence landed with precision, not as a revelation meant to shock, but as a truth that had always been there, waiting for recognition. No one interrupted, no one questioned it, because the system had already confirmed it, the signals had already aligned, and now the words simply gave form to what the room had begun to understand. Daniel's lips parted slightly as if to respond, but nothing came out. Because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reframe. Only the weight of what he had done and the realization of who he had done it to. The younger attendant lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back at Naomi with quiet respect, her earlier uncertainty replaced by clarity, and in that shift, she became something more than a witness. She became a line between what had been and what was now changing. Across the aisle, the man in the suit leaned back fully, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by a careful stillness. While the woman beside him pressed her hands together in her lap, her eyes fixed forward, absorbing every second of the moment. Another tone sounded from the system, followed by a brief flicker on the panel, and then a clear update appeared, one that did not require interpretation, one that spoke in the same language Daniel had relied on moments before, but now it spoke for someone else. Naomi did not look at the screen. She did not need to. Instead, she kept her focus on Daniel, and her next words were softer, but carried more weight than anything she had said so far. You made a decision. Based on what you thought you saw. She continued, her tone calm, unwavering, not on what was true. And that distinction settled heavily into the space between them. Daniel lowered his gaze for the first time, the realization no longer something he could push aside, and in that moment, the dynamic was complete, the reversal not loud or chaotic, but absolute. Naomi paused briefly, then added one final sentence, the kind that did not just end the moment but defined it. And now you are standing in the consequence of that decision. And the cabin held that silence again. But this time it was different, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved, as if everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear without a single raised voice, without a single dramatic gesture, just truth, delivered at exactly the moment it could no longer be ignored. The final shift did not arrive with noise. It arrived with confirmation, quiet, precise, and irreversible, as the system panel near the front of the cabin emitted a single, clear tone that cut through the silence more effectively than any raised voice ever could. And this time every head turned, not out of curiosity, but because something in that sound felt different, final. The younger attendant looked down at the display, her eyes scanning quickly before she inhaled and spoke, her voice steady but carrying the weight of what she was reading. Crew access privileges have been revoked, she said, and the words landed in the cabin like a line being drawn, not debated, not delayed, simply enforced. Daniel did not move at first, as if the meaning had not fully reached him, but then his hand shifted toward the panel instinctively, pressing a control he had used countless times before, only for it to remain unresponsive, the interface no longer recognizing his authority. And in that small, undeniable moment, the last illusion of control disappeared. Across the aisle, the man in the tailored suit exhaled slowly, leaning back as if witnessing something rare, while the woman beside him lowered her gaze briefly. The earlier assumptions she had carried now replaced with something quieter, something closer to reflection. Naomi remained seated, unchanged, her posture as calm as it had been from the beginning. But now the entire environment reflected what had always been true. The system aligned with her presence. The authority she carried no longer invisible, no longer questioned. A second update appeared on the panel, and this time the younger attendant did not hesitate to read it aloud. Leadership command reassigned, she said, her voice clear, and though she did not say Naomi's name, she did not need to, because every person in that cabin understood exactly what it meant. Daniel stepped back slightly, not forced, not directed, but because there was nowhere else for him to stand within a space that no longer responded to him. His expression no longer defensive, no longer resistant, but something quieter, something closer to realization. Naomi turned her head just enough to meet his gaze once more, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm authority that had defined every moment before this one. This was never about a seat, she said, each word measured, intentional. It was about how you chose to treat someone you believed had no power, and that truth settled deeper than anything the system could display. The cabin remained still, not tense, not uncertain, but grounded in the outcome that had already taken shape, the reversal complete without spectacle, without chaos, just a series of decisions meeting their consequences in real time. Naomi allowed a brief pause, then added one final instruction, her tone unchanged. You are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. And there was no need for emphasis, no need for repetition, because the system had already enforced what she had just spoken, the authority behind her words not symbolic, but absolute. The younger attendant lowered the tablet slowly, her posture straightening as if aligning herself with a new standard, while the rest of the cabin absorbed the moment in silence. each person witnessing not just a resolution, but a correction, one that did not require anger, did not require volume, only truth, timing, and the quiet certainty of someone who had never needed to prove where she belonged, only to reveal it when the moment demanded it. The cabin did not return to normal right away, and that was the part no one expected, because moments like this did not simply end. They settled, they lingered, they left something behind in the air that could not be undone. Daniel stood still for a second longer, then slowly stepped back into the narrow space near the galley, not guided, not escorted, just moving because there was no longer a place for him at the center of the room he once controlled, and no one stopped him, no one spoke. Because the outcome had already been decided long before he took that step. The younger attendant adjusted her posture, her shoulders straightening, her expression focused, and without hesitation she moved toward Naomi, not nervously, not uncertainly, but with quiet professionalism. "Is there anything you would like, ma'am?" she asked, her tone respectful, not performative, and Naomi met her gaze briefly, offering a small nod that carried more acknowledgement than any extended conversation could. Across the aisle, the man in the tailored suit shifted forward again, his voice low but clear enough to be heard. "I think we all just learned something," he said, not directed at anyone in particular, but the statement settled into the space as truth rather than commentary, and the woman beside him gave a slight nod, her earlier certainty replaced with a quieter understanding. Naomi leaned back slightly in her seat, her hand resting calmly against the armrest, her posture unchanged from the moment she first sat down, but now the room around her reflected that same stillness, aligned, aware, corrected. The engines continued their steady hum, the aircraft cutting through the sky at 30,000 feet as if nothing had changed, yet everything inside had shifted in a way that would not be forgotten. Naomi's gaze moved briefly toward the window again, the reflection showing a cabin no longer divided by assumption, but unified by a moment of truth that had revealed itself without force. She turned back toward the aisle, her voice quiet but clear, carrying just enough to reach those closest to her. "Respect should never be based on what you think you see," she said, the words simple, but anchored in something far deeper, because what you see is often the least important part of who someone is. And no one interrupted, no one questioned it, because the moment had already proven it beyond argument. The younger attendant nodded slightly, absorbing the statement not as instruction, but as something to carry forward, while the rest of the cabin remained still, each person processing the same realization in their own way. Naomi allowed a brief pause, then added one final line, her tone unchanged, steady, and certain. "I did not raise my voice," she said, her eyes calm, her presence grounded. "I raised the standard." And with that, the moment closed not with noise, not with applause, but with understanding, the kind that stays long after the aircraft lands, long after the seats are empty, long after the system resets, because what happened in that cabin was not just a correction of authority, it was a reminder, quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore, that power does not need to announce itself, it only needs the right moment to be seen.